Let's resume The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Chapter 12 The Sayers of the Law. Then something cold touched my hand. I started violently and saw close to me a dim pinkish thing, looking more like a flayed child than anything else in the world. The creature had exactly the mild but repulsive features of a sloth, the same low forehead and slow gestures. As the first shock of the change of light passed, I saw about me more distinctly. The little sloth-like creature was standing and staring at me. My conductor had vanished. The place was a narrow passage between high walls of lava, a crack in the knotted rock, and on either side interwoven heaps of cement. Palm fans and reeds leaning against the rock formed rough and impenetrably dark dens. The winding way up the ravine between these was scarcely 3 yards wide, and was disfigured by lumps of decaying fruit pulp and other refuse, which accounted for the disagreeable stench of the place. The little pink sloth creature was still blinking at me when my ape man reappeared at the aperture of the nearest of these dens and beckoned me in. As he did so, a slouching monster wriggled out of one of the places further up this strange street and stood up in the featureless silhouette against the bright green beyond, staring at me. I hesitated, having half a mind to bolt the way I had come, and then determined to go through with the adventure. I gripped my nailed stick about the middle and crawled into the little evil-smelling lean-to after my conductor. It was a semicircular space, shaped like the half of a beehive, and against the rocky wall that formed the inner side of it was a pile of variegated fruits, coconuts, among others. Some rough vessels of lava and wood stood about the floor, and one on a rough stool. There was no fire. In the darkest corner of the hut sat a shapeless mass of darkness that grunted, "Hey!" as I came in, and my ape man stood in the dim light of the doorway and held out a split coconut to me as I crawled into the other corner and squatted down. I need a moment. My allergies. Ugh. I have to take a pill for these. Or it's going to be hard to speak. Okay. I took it and began gnawing at it as serenely as possible, in spite of a certain trepidation and the nearly intolerable closeness of the den. The little pink sloth creature stood in the aperture of the hut, and something else with a drab face and bright eyes came staring over its shoulder. "Hey!" came out of the lump of mystery opposite. "It is a man." "It is a man," gabbled my conductor. A man, a 5-man, like me." "Shut up," said the voice from the dark, and grunted. I gnawed my coconut amid an impressive stillness. I peered hard into the blackness, but could distinguish nothing. "It is a man," the voice repeated. "He comes to live with us?" It was a thick voice with something in it, a kind of whistling overtone that struck me as peculiar, but the English accent was strangely good. The ape man looked at me as though he expected something. I perceived the pause was interrogative. "He comes to live with you," I said. "It is a man. He must learn the law." I began to distinguish now a deeper blackness in the black, a vague outline of a hunched up figure. Then I noticed the opening of the place was darkened by two more black heads. My hand tightened on my stick. The thing in the dark repeated in a louder tone, "Say the words." I had missed its last remark. "Not to go on all fours, that is the law." It repeated in a kind of sing-song. I was puzzled. "Say the words," said the ape-man, repeating, and the figures in the doorway echoed this, with a threat in the tone of their voices. I realized that I had to repeat this idiotic formula, and then began the insanest ceremony. The voice in the dark began intoning a mad litany, line by line, and I and the rest to repeat it. As they did so, they swayed from side to side in the oddest way, and beat their hands upon their knees, and I followed their example. I could have imagined I was already dead and in another world. That dark hut, these grotesque dim figures, just flecked here and there by a glimmer of light, and all of them swaying in unison and chanting, "Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat fish or flesh, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to claw the bark of trees, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men?" And so from the prohibition of these acts of folly onto the prohibition of what I thought then were the maddest, most impossible, and most indecent things one could well imagine. A kind of rhythmic fervor fell on all of us. We gabbled and swayed faster and faster, repeating this amazing law. Okay, gabbled, he's used that word twice. Let me see, I need to look that up. I have not seen this word before. Verb past tense, gabbled. Talk rapidly and unintelligibly, utter meaningless sounds. Okay, got it. Gabbled. Where was I? A kind of rhythmic fervor fell on all of us. We gabbled and swayed faster and faster, repeating this amazing law. Superficially, the contagion of these brutes was upon me, but deep down within me the laughter and disgust struggled together. We ran through a long list of prohibitions, and then the chant swung round to a new formula. His is the house of pain. His is the hand that makes. His is the hand that wounds. His is the hand that heals. And so on for another long series, mostly quite incomprehensible gibberish to me about him, whoever he might be. I could have fancied it was a dream, but never before have I heard chanting in a dream. He is the lightning flash, we sang. He is the deep, salt sea. A horrible fancy came into my head that Moreau, after animalizing these men, had infected their dwarfed brains with a kind of deification of himself. However, I was too keenly aware of white teeth and strong claws about me to stop my chanting on that account. His are the stars in the sky. At last that song ended. I saw the ape-man's face shining with perspiration, and my eyes being now accustomed to the darkness, I saw more distinctly the figure in the corner from which the voice came. It was the size of a man, but it seemed covered with a dull gray hair, almost like a Skye terrier. What was it? What were they all? Imagine yourself surrounded by all the most horrible cripples and maniacs it is possible to conceive, and you may understand a little of my feelings with these grotesque caricatures of humanity about me. He is a five-man, like me, said the ape-man. I held up my hands. The gray creature in the corner leaned forward. Not to run on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? He said. He put out a strangely distorted talon and gripped my fingers. The thing was almost like the hoof of a deer produced into claws. I could have yelled with surprise and pain. His face came forward and peered at my nails, came forward into the light of the opening of the hut, and I saw with a quivering disgust that it was like the face of neither man nor beast, but a mere shock of gray hair with 3 shadowy overarchings to mark the eyes and mouth. "He has little nails," said this grisly creature in his hairy beard. "It is well." He threw my hands down, and instinctively I gripped my stick. "Eat rubes and herbs. It is his will," said the ape-man. "I am the sayer of the law," said the gray figure. "Here come all that be new to learn the law. I sit in the darkness and say the law." "It is even so," said one of the beasts in the doorway. "Evil are the punishments of those who break the law. None escape." "None escape," said the beast folk, glancing furtively at one another. None, said the ape-man. "None escape. See, I did a little thing, a wrong thing once. I jabbered, stopped talking. None could understand. I am Bert, branded in the hand. He is great, he is good." "None escape," said the gray creature in the corner. "None escape," said the beast people, looking askance at one another. "For everyone the want that is bad," said the gray sayer of the law. "What you will want we do not know. We shall know. Some want to follow things that move, to watch and slink and wait and spring, to kill and bite deep and rich, sucking the blood. It is bad. Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat flesh or fish, that is the law. Are we not men?" "None escape," said a dappled brute standing in the doorway. Dappled? Another vocabulary word for us. Dappled brute. Dappled, marked with spots or rounded patches. "None escape," said a dappled brute, standing in the doorway. "For everyone the want is bad," said the gray sayer of the law. "Some want to go tearing with teeth and hands into the roots of things, snuffing into the earth. It is bad." "None escape," said the men in the door. "Some go clawing trees, some go scratching at the graves of the dead, some go fighting with foreheads or feet or claws, some bite suddenly, none giving occasion, some love uncleanness." "None escape," said the ape-man, scratching his calf. "None escape," said the little pink sloth creature. "Punishment is sharp and sure, therefore learn the law, say the words." And incontinently he began again the strange litany of the law, and again I and all these creatures began singing and swaying. My head reeled with this jabbering and the close stench of the place, but I kept on, trusting to find presently some chance of a new development. "Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men?" We were making such a noise that I noticed nothing of a tumult outside until someone who I think was one of the 2 swine men I had seen thrust his head over the little pink sloth creature and shouted something excitedly, something that I did not catch. Incontinently, those at the opening of the hut vanished. My ape-man rushed out. The thing that sat in the dark followed him. I only observed that it was big and clumsy and covered with silvery hair, and I was left alone. Then, before I reached the aperture, I heard the yelp of a stag-hound. In another moment, I was standing outside the hovel, my chair rail in my hand, every muscle of me quivering. Before we were the clumsy backs of perhaps a score of these beast people, their misshapen heads half hidden by their shoulder blades. They were gesticulating excitedly. Other half-animal faces glared interrogation out of the hovels. Looking in the direction in which they faced, I saw coming through the haze under the trees beyond the end of the passage of dark dens the dark figure and awful white face of Moreau. He was holding the leaping staghound back, and close behind him Montgomery came, revolver in hand. For a moment I stood horror-struck. I turned and saw the passage behind me blocked by another heavy brute with a huge gray face and twinkling little eyes, advancing towards me. I looked round and saw to the right of me and half a dozen yards in front of me a narrow gap in the wall of rock through which a ray of light slanted into the shadows. "Stop!" cried Moreau as I strode towards this, and then, "Hold him!" At that, first one face turned towards me, and then others. Their bestial minds were happily slow. I dashed my shoulder into a clumsy monster who was turning to see what Moreau meant, and flung him forward into another. I felt his hands fly round, clutching at me and missing. The little pink sloth creature dashed at me, and I gashed down its ugly face with the nail in my stick, and in another minute was scrambling up a steep side pathway, a kind of sloping chimney out of the ravine. I heard a howl behind me and cries of, "Catch him! Hold him!" The gray-faced creature appeared behind me, and I jammed his huge bulk into the cleft. Go on, they howled. I clambered up the narrow cleft in the rock and came out upon the sulphur on the westward side of the village of the Beastmen. That gap was altogether fortunate for me, for the narrow chimney, slanting obliquely upward, must have impeded the nearer pursuers. I ran over the white space and down a steep slope, through a scattered growth of trees, and came to a low-lying stretch of tall reeds, through which I pushed into a dark, thick undergrowth that was black and succulent underfoot. As I plunged into the reeds, my foremost pursuers emerged from the gap. I broke my way through this undergrowth for some minutes. The air behind me and about me was soon full of threatening cries. I heard the tumult of my pursuers in the gap of the slope, then the crashing of the reeds, and every now and then the crackling crash of a branch. Some of the creatures roared like excited beasts of prey. The staghound yelped to the left. I heard Moreau and Montgomery shouting in the same direction. I turned sharply to the right. It seemed to me even then that I heard Montgomery shouting for me to run for my life. Presently, the ground gave rich and oozy under my feet, but I was desperate and went headlong into it, struggled through knee-deep, and so came to a winding path among tall canes. The noise of my pursuers passed away to my left. In one place, 3 strange pink hopping animals, about the size of cats, bolted before my footsteps. This pathway ran uphill across another open space covered with white incrustation and plunged into a canebrake again. Then suddenly it turned parallel with the edge of a steep-walled gap, which came without warning like the ha-ha of an English park, turned with an unexpected abruptness. I was still running with all my might, and I never saw this drop until I was flying headlong through the air. I fell on my forearms and head among thorns and rose with a torn ear and bleeding face. I had fallen into a precipitous ravine, rocky and thorny, full of a hazy mist which drifted about me in wisps, and with a narrow streamlet from which this mist came meandering down the center. I was astonished at this thin fog in the full blaze of daylight, but I had no time to stand wondering then. I turned to my right, downstream, hoping to come to the sea in that direction, and so have my way open to drown myself. It was only later I found that I had dropped my nailed stick in my fall. Presently, the ravine grew narrow for a space, and carelessly I stepped into the stream. I jumped out again pretty quickly, for the water was almost boiling. I noticed, too, there was a thin sulphurous scum drifting upon its coiling water. Almost immediately came a turn in the ravine, and the indistinct blue horizon. The nearer sea was flashing the sun from a myriad facets. I saw my death before me, but I was hot and panting, with the warm blood oozing out on my face and running pleasantly through my veins. I felt more than a touch of exultation, too, at having distanced my pursuers. It was not in me, then, to go out and drown myself yet. I stared back the way I had come. I listened, save for the hum of the gnats and the chirp of some small insects that hopped among the thorns. The air was absolutely still. Then came the yelp of a dog, very faint and a chattering and gibbering, the snap of a whip and voices. They grew louder and fainter again. The noise receded up the stream and faded away. For a while the chase was over, but I knew now how much hope of help for me lay in the beast people. Chapter 13, A Parley. I turned again and went on down towards the sea. I found the hot stream broadened out to a shallow, weedy sand, in which an abundance of crabs and long-bodied, many-legged creatures started from my footfall. I walked to the very edge of the salt water, and then I felt I was safe. I turned and stared, arms akimbo, at the thick green behind me, into which the steamy ravine cut like a smoking gash. But as I say, I was too full of excitement and, a true saying, though those who have never known danger may doubt it, too desperate to die. Then it came into my head that there was one chance before me yet. While Moreau and Montgomery and their bestial rabble chased me through the island, might I not go round the beach until I came to their enclosure, make a flank march upon them, in fact, and then with a rock lugged out of their loosely built wall, perhaps smash in the lock of a smaller door and see what I could find, knife, pistol, or whatnot, to fight them with when they returned. It was at any rate something to try. So I turned to the westward and walked along by the water's edge. The setting sun flashed his blinding heat into my eyes. The slight Pacific tide was running in with a gentle ripple. Presently the shore fell away southward, and the sun came round upon my right hand. Then, suddenly, far in front of me, I saw first one and then several figures emerging from the bushes. Moreau, with his gray staghound, then Montgomery and two others. At that I stopped. They saw me and began gesticulating and advancing. I stood watching them approach. The two beast men came running forward to cut me off from the undergrowth inland. Montgomery came, running also, but straight towards me. Moreau followed slower with the dog. At last I roused myself from my inaction, and turning seaward, walked straight into the water. The water was very shallow at first. I was 30 yards out before the waves reached my waist. Dimly I could see the intertidal creatures darting away from my feet. "What are you doing, man?" cried Montgomery. I turned, standing waist deep, and stared at them. Montgomery stood panting at the margin of the water. His face was bright red with exertion, his long flaxen hair blown about his head, and his dropping nether lip showed his irregular teeth. Moreau was just coming up, his face pale and firm, and the dog at his hand barked at me. Both men had heavy whips. Farther up the beach stared the beast men. "Well, thank you for that subscription, Steam Vents. Welcome to the channel. Scroll down to see your subscriber perks." Where was I? Both men had heavy whips. Farther up the beach stared the beast men. "What am I doing? I'm going to drown myself," said I. Montgomery and Moreau looked at each other. "Why?" asked Moreau. "Because that is better than being tortured by you." "I told you so," said Montgomery, and Moreau said something in a low tone. "What makes you think I shall torture you?" asked Moreau. "What I saw," I said, "and those yonder." Thank you, Steam Vince. Ooh. "Hush," said Moreau, and held up his hand. "I will not," said I. "They were men. What are they now? I at least will not be like them." I looked past my interlocutors. Up the beach were Maling, Montgomery's attendant, and one of the white-swathed brutes from the boat. Hang on, that's a word. I forgot what that means. Interlocutor. I think it means speaker, because I know I looked this up before. Yes, a person who takes part in a dialogue or conversation. Hey, Sheckerbecker. Ooh, another reading stream. Sits back with a cup of tea and blanket. Hey, Jubilee. Obi, welcome. Yes, another reading stream. Okay, where was I? I looked past my interlocutors up the beach where Maling, Montgomery's attendant, and one of the white-swathed brutes from the boat. Farther up, in the shadow of the trees, I saw my little ape man, and behind him some other dim figures. I'm just laying down trying to fall asleep with the reading. Okay, Sheckerbecker. Who are these creatures? Said I, pointing to them and raising my voice, and more that it might reach them. They were men like yourselves, whom you have infected with some bestial taint, men whom you have enslaved, and whom you still fear. You who listen, I cried, pointing now to Moreau and shouting past him to the beast men. You who listen, do you not see these men still fear you, go in dread of you? Why then do you fear them? You are many. For God's sake, cried Montgomery. Stop that, Prendick. Prendick, cried Moreau. They both shouted together as if to drown my voice, and behind them lowered the staring faces of the beast men. Wondering, their deformed hands hanging down, their shoulders hunched up, they seemed, as I fancied, to be trying to understand me, to remember, I thought, something of their human past. I went on shouting, I scarcely remember what, that Moreau and Montgomery could be killed, that they were not to be feared. That was the burden of what I put into the heads of the beast people. I saw the green-eyed man in the dark rags who had met me on the evening of my arrival come out from among the trees, and others followed him to hear me better. At last, for want of breath, I paused. Listen to me for a moment, said the steady voice of Moreau, and then say what you will. Well, said I. Honey, I'm going to shower. Okay, honey. He coughed, thought, then shouted, Latin, Prendick! Bad Latin, schoolboy Latin, but try and understand. He non sunt homines, sunt animalia qui nos habemus vivisected. A humanizing process. I will explain. Come ashore. I laughed. A pretty story, said I. They talk, build houses. They were men. It's likely I'll come ashore. The water just beyond where you stand is deep and full of sharks. That's my way, said I. Short and sharp, presently. Wait a minute. He took something out of his pocket that flashed back the sun and dropped the object at his feet. That's a loaded revolver, said he. Montgomery here will do the same. Now we are going up the beach until you are satisfied the distance is safe. Then come and take the revolvers. Not I. You have a third between you. I want you to think over things, Prendick. In the first place, I never asked you to come upon this island. If we vivisected men, we should import men, not beasts. In the next, we had you drugged last night, had we wanted to work you any mischief, and in the next, now your first panic is over, and you can think a little. Is Montgomery here quite up to the character you give him? We have chased you for your good, because the island is full of inimical phenomena. Besides, why should we want to shoot you when you have just offered to drown yourself? Why did you set your people onto me when I was in the hut? We felt sure of catching you and bringing you out of danger. Afterwards, we drew away from the scent for your good. I mused. It seemed just possible. Then I remembered something again. But I saw, said I, in the enclosure. That was the puma. Look here, Prendick, said Montgomery. You're a silly ass. Come out of the water and take these revolvers and talk. We can't do anything more than we could do now. I will confess then, and indeed always, I distrusted and dreaded Moreau, but Montgomery was a man I felt I understood. Go up the beach, said I, after thinking, and added, holding your hands up. Can't do that, said Montgomery, with an explanatory nod over his shoulder. Undignified. Go up to the trees, then, said I, as you please. It's a damned silly ceremony, said Montgomery. Both turned and faced the 6 or 7 grotesque creatures who stood there in the sunlight, solid, casting shadows, moving, and yet so incredibly unreal. Montgomery cracked his whip at them, and forthwith they all turned and fled, helter-skelter, into the trees, and when Montgomery and Moreau were at a distance I judged sufficient, I waded ashore, and picked up and examined the revolvers. To satisfy myself against the subtlest trickery, I discharged one at a round lump of lava, and had the satisfaction of seeing the stone pulverized and the beach splashed with lead. Still, I hesitated for a moment. I'll take the risk, said I, at last, and with a revolver in each hand, I walked up the beach towards them. That's better, said Moreau, without affection. As it is, you have wasted the best part of my day with your confounded imagination. And with a touch of contempt which humiliated me, he and Montgomery turned and went on in silence before me. The knot of the beast men, still wondering, stood back among the trees. I passed them as serenely as possible. One started to follow me, but retreated again when Montgomery cracked his whip. The rest stood silent, watching. They may once have been animals, but I never before saw an animal trying to think. Chapter 14. Dr. Moreau Explains. And now, Prendick, I will explain, said Dr. Moreau, so soon as we had eaten and drunk. I must confess that you are the most dictatorial guest I have ever entertained. I warn you that this is the last I shall do to oblige you. The next thing you threaten to commit suicide about, I shan't do, even at some personal inconvenience. He sat in my deck chair, a cigar half consumed in his white, dexterous-looking fingers. The light of the swinging lamp fell on his white hair. He stared through the little window out at the starlight. I sat as far away from him as possible, the table between us and the revolvers to hand. Montgomery was not present. I did not care to be with the two of them in such a little room. You admit that the vivisected human being, as you called it, is, after all, only the puma? Said Moreau. He had made me visit that horror in the inner room to assure myself of its inhumanity. It is the puma, I said, still alive, but so cut and mutilated as I pray I may never see living flesh again. Of all the vile— Never mind that, said Moreau. At least spare me those youthful horrors. Montgomery used to be just the same. You admit that it is the puma. Now be quiet, while I reel off my physiological lecture to you. And forthwith, beginning in the tone of a man supremely bored, but presently warming a little, he explained his work to me. He was very simple and convincing. Now and then there was a touch of sarcasm in his voice. Presently I found myself hot with shame at our mutual positions. The creatures I had seen were not men, and never had been men. They were animals, humanized animals, triumphs of vivisection. You forget all that a skilled vivisector can do with living things, said Moreau. For my own part, I am puzzled why the things I have done here have not been done before. Small efforts, of course, have been made: amputation, tongue-cutting, excisions. Of course, you know a squint may be induced or cured by surgery. Then, in the case of excisions, you have all kinds of secondary changes, pigmentary disturbances, modifications of the passions, alterations in the secretion of fatty tissue. I have no doubt you have heard of these things. Of course, said I. But these foul creatures of yours. All in good time, said he, waving his hand at me. I am only the beginning. Those are trivial cases of alteration. Surgery can do better things than that. There is building up as well as breaking down and changing. You have heard, perhaps, of a common surgical operation resorted to in cases where the nose has been destroyed. A flap of skin is cut from the forehead, turned down on the nose, and heals in the new position. This is a kind of grafting in a new position of part of an animal upon itself. Grafting of freshly obtained material from another animal is also possible. The case of teeth, for example. The grafting of skin and bone is done to facilitate healing. The surgeon places in the middle of the wound pieces of skin snipped from another animal or fragments of bone from a victim freshly killed. Hunter's cockspur, possibly have you heard of that, flourished on the bull's neck, and the rhinoceros rats of the Algerian zouaves are what? Hold on. I have no idea how to say this word. Zouaves. Gotta look that up. Zouaves.
Jouave.
Ah, Jouave. Do that again. Jouave. A member of a light infantry corps in the French army, originally formed of Algerians and long retaining their oriental uniform. What is he talking? What is he? Okay. Hunter's cockspur. Possibly you have heard of that. Flourished on the bull's neck. And the rhinoceros rats of the Algerian zouaves are also to be thought of. Monsters manufactured by transferring a slip from the tail of an ordinary rat to its snout and allowing it to heal in that position. Monsters manufactured, said I. Then you mean to tell me? Yes. These creatures you have seen are animals carven and wrought into new shapes. To the study of the plasticity of living forms, my life has been devoted. I have studied for years, gaining in knowledge as I do so. I see you look horrified, and yet I am telling you nothing new. It all lay in the surface of practical anatomy, years ago, but no one had the temerity to touch it. It is not simply the outward form of an animal which I can change. The physiology, the chemical rhythm of the creature may also be made to undergo an enduring modification, of which vaccination and other methods of inoculation with living or dead matter are examples that will no doubt be familiar to you. A similar operation is the transfusion of blood, with which subject, indeed, I began. These are all familiar cases. Less so, and probably far more extensive, were the operations of those medieval practitioners who made dwarfs and beggar cripples, show monsters, some vestiges of whose art still remain in the preliminary manipulation of the young mountebank or contortionist. Wow, a lot of vocabulary words here. I think I said that right. We'll check. Mountebank.
Mountebank.
Close. Mountebank. A person who deceives others, especially in order to trick them out of their money. A charlatan. Yes. Some vestiges of whose art still remain in the preliminary manipulation of the young mountebank or contortionist. Victor Hugo gives an account of them in La Lahomquerie, sorry. But perhaps my meaning grows plain now. You begin to see that it is a possible thing to transplant tissue from one part of an animal to another, or from one animal to another, to alter its chemical reactions and methods of growth, to modify the articulations of its limbs, and indeed to change it in its most intimate structure. And yet, this extraordinary branch of knowledge has never been sought as an end and systematically by modern investigators until I took it up. Some such things have been hit upon in the last resort of surgery by most of the kindred evidence that will recur to your mind has been demonstrated, as it were, by accident, by tyrants, by criminals, by the breeders of horses and dogs, by all kinds of untrained, clumsy-handed men working for their own immediate ends. I was the first man to take up this question, armed with antiseptic surgery and with a really scientific knowledge of the laws of growth. Yet one would imagine it must have been practiced in secret before. Such creatures as the Siamese twins, and in the vaults of the Inquisition. No doubt their chief aim was artistic torture, but some at least of the inquisitors must have had a touch of scientific curiosity. But, said I, these animals talk. He said that was so, and proceeded to point out that the possibility of vivisection does not stop at a mere physical metamorphosis. A pig may be educated. The mental structure is even less determinate than the bodily. In our growing science of hypnotism, we find the promise of a possibility of superseding old inherent instincts by new suggestions, grafting upon or replacing the inherited fixed ideas. Very much indeed of what we call moral education, he said, is such an artificial modification and perversion of instinct. Pugnacity is trained into courageous self-sacrifice, and suppressed sexuality into religious emotion. And the great difference between man and monkey is in the larynx, he continued, in the incapacity to frame delicately different sound symbols by which thought could be sustained. In this I failed to agree with him, but with a certain incivility he declined to notice my objection. He repeated that the thing was so, and continued his account of his work. I asked him why he had taken the human form as a model. There seemed to me then, and there still seems to me now, a strange wickedness for that choice. He confessed that he had chosen that form by chance. I might just as well have worked to form sheep into llamas and llamas into sheep. I suppose there is something in the human form that appeals to the artistic turn of mind more powerfully than any animal shape can, but I have not confined myself to man-making. Once or twice. He was silent for a minute, perhaps. These years, how they have slipped by, and here I have wasted a day saving your life, and am now wasting an hour explaining myself. But, said I still do not understand. Where is your justification for inflicting all this pain? The only thing that could excuse vivisection to me would be some application. Precisely, said he. But you see, I am differently constituted. We are on different platforms. You are a materialist. I am not a materialist, I began hotly. In my view, but for it is just this question of pain that parts us. So long as a visible or audible pain turns you sick, so long as your own pains drive you, so long as pain underlies your propositions about sin, so long, I tell you, you are an animal, thinking a little less obscurely what an animal feels. This pain, I gave an impatient shrug at such sophistry. Oh, but it is such a little thing. A mind truly open to what science has to teach must see that it is a little thing. It may be that, save in this little planet, this speck of cosmic dust, invisible long before the nearest star could be attained, it may be, I say, that nowhere else does this thing called pain occur. But the laws we feel our way towards, why even on this earth, even among living things, what pain is there? Hey, Onyx. As he spoke, he drew a little penknife from his pocket, opened the smaller blade, and moved his chair so that I could see his thigh. Then, choosing the place deliberately, he drove the blade into his leg and withdrew it. No doubt, he said, you have seen that before. It does not hurt, a pin-prick, but what does it show? The capacity for pain is not needed in the muscle, and it is not placed there. It is but little needed in the skin, and only here and there over the thigh as a spot capable of feeling pain. Pain is simply our intrinsic medical advisor to warn us and stimulate us. Not all living flesh is painful, nor is all nerve, not even all sensory nerve. There's no taint of pain, real pain, in the sensations of the optic nerve. If you wound the optic nerve, you merely see flashes of light, just as disease of the auditory nerve merely means a humming in our ears. Plants do not feel pain, nor the lower animals. It's possible that such animals as the starfish and crayfish do not feel pain at all. Then with men, the more intelligent they become, the more intelligently they will see after their own welfare, and the less they will need the goad to keep them out of danger. I never yet heard of a useless thing that was not ground out of existence by evolution sooner or later. Did you? And pain gets needless. Then I am a religious man, Prendick, as every sane man must be. It may be, I fancy, that I have seen more of the ways of this world's maker than you, for I have sought his laws in my way all my life, while you, I understand, have been collecting butterflies. And I tell you, pleasure and pain have nothing to do with heaven or hell. Pleasure and pain, bah! What is your theologian's ecstasy but Mahomet's huri in the dark? Well, okay, what? Huri? Another new word for me. Auri? Let's look it up.
Huri.
It is huri. A beautiful young woman, especially one of the virgin companions of the faithful in the Muslim paradise. What is your theologian's ecstasy but Mahomet's huri in the dark? This store which men and women set on pleasure and pain, Prendick, is the mark of the beast upon them, the mark of the beast from which they came. Pain and pleasure, they are for us only so long as we wriggle in the dust. You see, I went on with this research just the way it led me. That is the only way I ever heard of true research going. I asked a question, devised some method of attaining an answer, and got a fresh question. Was this possible or that possible? You cannot imagine what this means to an investigator when an intellectual passion grows upon him. You cannot imagine the strange, colorless delight of these intellectual desires. The thing before you is no longer an animal, a fellow creature, but a problem. Sympathetic pain. All I know of it, I remember as a thing I used to suffer from years ago. It was the one thing I wanted, to find out the extreme limit of plasticity in a living shape. But, said I, the thing is an abomination. To this day, I have never troubled about the ethics of the matter, he continued. The study of nature makes a man, at last, as remorseless as nature. I have gone on, not heeding anything but the question I was pursuing, and the material has dripped into the huts yonder. It is nearly 11 years since we came here, I and Montgomery and 6 Kanakas. I remember the green stillness of the island and the empty ocean about us, as though it was yesterday. The place seemed waiting for me. The stores were landed, and the house was built. The Kanakas found some huts near the ravine. I went to work here upon what I had brought with me. There were some disagreeable things that happened at first. I began with a sheep and killed it after a day and a half by a slip of the scalpel. I took another sheep and made a thing of pain and fear and left it bound up to heal. It looked quite human to me when I had finished it, but when I went to it I was discontented with it. It remembered me and was terrified beyond imagination, and it had no more than the wits of a sheep. The more I looked at it, the clumsier it seemed, until at last I put the monster out of its misery. These animals without courage, these fear-haunted, pain-driven things, without a spark of pugnacious energy to face torment, they are no good for man-making. And I can't remember what pugnacious means. So let's make that another vocabulary word. Pugnacious, eager or quick to argue, quarrel, or fight.
Pugnacious.
Yeah. Okay. These animals without courage, these fear-haunted, pain-driven things without a spark of pugnacious energy to face torment, they are no good for me, or man-making. Then I took a gorilla I had, and upon that, working with infinite care and mastering difficulty after difficulty, I made my first man. All the week, night and day I molded him. With him it was chiefly the brain that needed molding. Much had to be added, much changed. I thought him a fair specimen of the negroid type when I had finished him, and he lay bandaged, bound, and motionless before me. It was only when his life was assured that I left him and came into this room again and found Montgomery much as you are. He had heard some of the cries as the thing grew humid, cries like those that disturbed you, so I didn't take him completely into my confidence at first. And the Kanakas, too, had realized something of it. They were scared out of their wits by the sight of me. I got Montgomery over to me, in a way, but I and he had the hardest job to prevent the Kanakas deserting. Finally they did, and so we lost the yacht. I spent many days educating the brute. Altogether I had him for 3 or 4 months. I taught him the rudiments of English, gave him ideas of counting, and even made the thing read the alphabet. But at that he was slow, though I've met idiots slower. He began with a clean sheet mentally, had no memories left in his mind of what he had been. When his scars were quite healed, and he was no longer anything but painful and stiff, and able to converse a little, I took him yonder and introduced him to the Kanakas as an interesting stowaway. They were horribly afraid of him at first, somehow, which offended me rather, for I was conceited about him, but his ways seemed so mild, and he was so abject, that after a time they received him and took his education in hand. He was quick to learn, very imitative and adaptive, and built himself a hovel rather better, it seemed to me, than their own shanties. There was among the boys a bit of a missionary, and he taught the thing to read, or at least to pick out letters, and gave him some rudimentary ideas of morality. But it seems the beast's habits were not all that is desirable. I rested from work for some days after this, and was in a mind to write an account of the whole affair, to wake up English physiology. Then I came upon the creature squatting up in a tree and gibbering at 2 of the Kanakas who had been teasing him. I threatened him, told him the inhumanity of such a proceeding had aroused his sense of shame, and came home resolved to do better before I took my work back to England. I have been doing better. But somehow the things drift back again. The stubborn beast flesh grows day by day back again. But I mean to do better things still. I mean to conquer that. This puma. But that's the story. All the Kanaka boys are dead now. 1 fell overboard of the launch, and 1 died of a wounded heel that he poisoned in some way with plant juice. 3 went away in the yacht, and I suppose and hope were drowned. The other 1 was killed. Well, I have replaced them. Montgomery went on much as you are disposed to do at first, and then... What became of the other one? Said I sharply. The other Kanaka who was killed. Hang on, he keeps using this word, I'm not sure. Let's look this one up too. Kanaka. Okay, Pacific Islander employed as an indentured labor in Australia, especially in the sugar and cotton plantations of Queensland. Hawaiian. What became of the other one, said I sharply, the other Kanaka who was killed? The fact is, after I made a number of human creatures, I made a thing. He hesitated. Yes, said I. It was killed. I don't understand, said I. Do you mean to say... It killed the Kanaka, yes. It killed several other things that it caught. We chased it for a couple of days. It only got loose by accident. I never meant it to get away. It wasn't finished. It was purely an experiment. It was a limbless thing with a horrible face that writhed along the ground in a serpentine fashion. It was immensely strong and in infuriating pain. It lurked in the woods for some days until we hunted it. Then it wriggled into the northern part of the island, and we divided the party to close in upon it. Montgomery insisted upon coming with me. The man had a rifle, and when his body was found, one of the barrels was curved into the shape of an S and very nearly bitten through. Montgomery shot the thing. After that, I stuck to the ideal of humanity, except for little things. He became silent. I sat in silence, watching his face. So for 20 years altogether, counting 9 years in England, I have been going on, and there is still something in everything I do that defeats me, makes me dissatisfied, challenges me to further effort. Sometimes I rise above my level, sometimes I fall below it, but always I fall short of the things I dream. The human shape I can get now, almost with ease, so that it is lithe and graceful, or thick and strong, but often there is trouble with the hands and the claws, painful things that I dare not shape too freely. But it is in the subtle grafting and reshaping one needs. That's awkward. But it is in the subtle grafting and reshaping one must needs do to the brain that my trouble lies. What? I am reading that right. But it is in the subtle grafting and reshaping one must needs do to the brain that my trouble lies. The intelligence is often oddly low, with unaccountable blank ends, unexpected gaps. At least satisfactory of all is something that I cannot touch somewhere. I cannot determine where, in the seat of the emotions. Cravings, instincts, desires that harm humanity. A strange hidden reservoir to burst forth suddenly and inundate the whole being of the creature with anger, hate, or fear. These creatures of mine seem strange and uncanny to you so soon as you begin to observe them, but to me, just after I make them, they seem to be indisputably human beings. It's afterwards, as I observe them, that the persuasion fades. First one animal trait, and then another creeps to the surface and stares out at me. But I will conquer yet. Each time I dip a living creature into the bath of burning pain, I say, this time I will burn out all the animal. This time I will make a rational creature of my own. After all, what is 10 years? It might have been 100,000 in the making. He thought darkly. But I am drawing near the fastness. This puma of mine, after a silence. And they revert. As soon as my hand is taken from them, the beast begins to creep back, begins to assert itself again. Another long silence. Okay, honey. Then you take the things you make into those dens? Said I. They go. I turn them out when I begin to feel the beast in them, and presently they wander there. They all dread this house and me. There is a kind of travesty of humanity over there. Montgomery knows about it, for he interferes in their affairs. He has trained one or two of them to our service. He's ashamed of it, but I believe he half likes some of those beasts. It's his business, not mine. They only sicken me with a sense of failure. I take no interest in them. I fancy they fall in the lines of Kanaka missionary marked out, and have a kind of mockery of a rational life. Poor beasts. There's something they call the law. Sing hymns about all thine. They build themselves their dens, gather fruit and pull herbs. Marry even. But I can see through it all, see into their very souls, and see there is nothing but the souls of beasts, beasts that perish, anger and the lust to live and gratify themselves. Yet they're odd, complex, like everything else alive. There's a kind of upward striving in them, part vanity, part waste sexual emotion, part waste curiosity. It only mocks me. I have some hope of this puma. I worked hard at her head and brain. And now, said he, standing up after a long gap of silence during which we had each pursued our own thoughts. "What do you think? Are you in fear of me still?" I looked at him, but saw a white-faced, white-haired man with calm eyes. Save for his serenity, the touch almost of beauty that resulted from his set tranquility and his magnificent build, he might have passed muster among 100 other comfortable old gentlemen. Then I shivered. By way of answer to his second question, I handed him a revolver with either hand. "Keep them," he said, and snatched at a yawn. He stood up, stared at me for a moment, and smiled. "You've had 2 eventful days," said he. "I should advise some sleep. I'm glad it's all clear. Good night." He thought me over for a moment, and then went out by the inner door. I immediately turned the key in the outer one. I sat down again, sat for a time in a kind of stagnant mood, so weary emotionally, mentally, and physically, that I could not think beyond the point at which he had left me. The black window stared at me like an eye. At last, with an effort, I put out the light and got into the hammock. Very soon, I was asleep. Chapter 14. Chapter 15, sorry. Chapter 15, concerning the beast folk. I woke early. Moreau's explanation stood before my mind, clear and definite, from the moment of my awakening. I got out of the hammock and went to the door to assure myself that the key was turned. Then I tried the window bar and found it firmly fixed. That these man-like creatures were in truth only bestial monsters, mere grotesque travesties of men, filled me with a vague uncertainty of their possibilities, which was far worse than any definite fear. A tapping came at the door, and I heard the gluttonous accents of Maling speaking. I pocketed one of the revolvers, keeping one hand upon it, and opened to him. "Good morning, sir," he said, bringing in addition to the customary herb breakfast, an ill-cooked rabbit. Montgomery followed him. His roving eye caught the position of my arm, and he smiled askew. The puma was resting to heal that day, but Moreau, who was singularly solitary in his habits, did not join us. I talked with Montgomery to clear my ideas of the way in which the beast folk lived. In particular, I was urgent to know how these inhuman monsters were kept from falling upon Moreau and Montgomery and from rending one another. He explained to me that the comparative safety of Moreau and himself was due to the limited mental scope of these monsters. In spite of their increased intelligence and the tendency of their animal instincts to reawaken, they had certain fixed ideas implanted by Moreau in their minds, which absolutely bounded their imaginations. They were really hypnotized. I had been told that certain things were impossible and that certain things were not to be done, and these prohibitions were woven into the texture of their minds beyond any possibility of disobedience or dispute. Ooh. Certain matters, however, in which old instinct was at war with Moreau's convenience, were in a less stable condition. A series of propositions called the law, I had already heard them recited, battled in their minds with the deep-seated, ever-rebellious cravings of their animal natures. This law they were ever repeating, I found, and ever breaking. Both Montgomery and Moreau displayed particular solicitude to keep them ignorant of the taste of blood. They feared the inevitable suggestions of that flavor. Montgomery told me that the law, especially among the feline beast people, became oddly weakened about nightfall, that then the animal was at its strongest, that a spirit of adventure sprang up in them at the dusk, when they would dare things they never seemed to dream about by day. To that I owed my stalking by the leopard man on the night of my arrival. But during these earlier days of my stay, they broke the law only furtively and after dark. In the daylight, there was a general atmosphere of respect for its multifarious prohibitions. And here, perhaps, I may give a few general facts about the island and the beast people. The island, which was of a regular outline and lay low upon the wide sea, had a total area, I suppose, of 7 or 8 square miles. It was volcanic in origin, and now fringed on 3 sides by coral reefs. Some fumaroles to the northward and a hot spring were the only vestiges of the forces that had long since originated it. Fumaroles. That's got me curious. What's a fumarole? Fumarole. Fumarole, an opening in or near a volcano through which hot sulfurous gases emerge. Okay. Some fumaroles to the northward, and a hot spring were the only vestiges of the forces that had long since originated it. Now and then a faint quiver of earthquake would be sensible, and sometimes the ascent of the spire of smoke would be rendered tumultuous by gusts of steam, but that was all. The population of the island, Montgomery informed me, now numbered rather more than 60 of these strange creations of Moreau's art, not counting the smaller monstrosities which lived in the undergrowth and were without human form. Altogether, he had made nearly 120, but many had died, and others, like the writhing, footless thing of which he had told me, had come by violent ends. In answer to my question, Montgomery said that they actually bore offspring, but that these generally died. When they lived, Moreau took them and stamped the human form upon them. There was no evidence of the inheritance of their acquired human characteristics. The females were less numerous than the males, and liable to much furtive persecution in spite of the monogamy the law enjoined. This description corresponds in every respect to Noble's Isle, CEP. It would be impossible for me to describe these beast people in detail. My eye has had no training in details, and I cannot sketch. Most striking, perhaps, in their general appearance was the disproportion between the legs of these creatures and the length of their bodies, and yet, so relative is our idea of grace, my eye became habituated to their forms, and at last I even fell in with their persuasion that my own long thighs were ungainly. Another point was the forward carriage of the head and the clumsy and inhuman curvature of the spine. Even the ape-man lacked that inward sinuous curve of the back which makes the human figure so grateful. Most had their shoulders hunched clumsily, and their short forearms hung weakly at their sides. Few of them were conspicuously hairy, at least until the end of my time upon the island. Hey, congrats, Onyx. The next most obvious deformity was in their faces, almost all of which were prognathous, malformed about the ears, with large and protuberant noses, very furry or very bristly hair, and often strangely colored or strangely placed eyes. Okay, prognathous? What? Prognathous? Was there? Yeah. I believe I'm saying that right. Let's find out. Prognathous. Oops. Prognathous. Having a projecting lower jaw or chin. Okay. Prognathous. The next most obvious deformity was in their faces, almost all of which were prognathous, malformed about the ears, with large and protuberant noses, very furry or very bristly hair, and often strangely colored or strangely placed eyes. None could laugh, though the ape-man had a chattering titter. Beyond these general characters, their heads had little in common. Each preserved the quality of its particular species. The human mark distorted, but did not hide the leopard, the ox, or the sow, or other animal or animals from which the creature had been molded. The voices, too, varied exceedingly. The hands were always malformed, and though some surprised me by their unexpected human appearance, almost all were deficient in the number of the digits, clumsy about the fingernails, and lacking any tactile sensibility. The two most formidable animal men were my leopard man and a creature made of hyena and swine. Larger than these were the three bull creatures who pulled in the boat. Then came the silvery, hairy man, who was also the sayer of the law, Maling, and a satyr-like creature of ape and goat. There were 3 swine men and a swine woman, a mare rhinoceros creature, and several other females whose sources I did not ascertain. There were several wolf creatures, a bear bull, and a Saint Bernard man. I have already described the ape man, and there was a particularly hateful and evil-smelling old woman made of vixen and bear, whom I hated from the beginning. She was said to be passionate votary of the law. Votary? Another new word.
Votary.
Votary, a person such as a monk or nun who has made vows of dedication to religious service. A devoted follower, adherent, or advocate of something. Okay. Yeah. There you are. Okay, where was I? She was said to be a passionate votary of the law. Smaller creatures were certain dabbled youths and my little sloth creature. But enough of this catalogue. At first I had had a shivering horror of the brutes, felt all too keenly that they were still brutes, but insensibly I became a little habituated to the idea of them, and moreover I was affected by Montgomery's attitude towards them. He had been with them so long that he had come to regard them as almost normal human beings. His London days seemed a glorious, impossible past to him. Only once in a year or so did he go to Arica to deal with Moreau's agent, a trader in animals there. He hardly met the finest type of mankind in that seafaring village of Spanish mongrels. The men aboard ship, he told me, seemed at first just as strange to him as the beast men seemed to me. Unnaturally long in the leg, flat in the face, prominent in the forehead, suspicious, dangerous, and cold-hearted. In fact, he did not like men. His heart had warmed to me, he thought, because he had saved my life. I fancied even that he had a sneaking kindness for some of these metamorphosed brutes, a vicious sympathy with some of their ways, but that he attempted to veil it from me at first. Maling, the black-faced man, Montgomery's attendant, the first of the beast folk I had encountered, did not live with the others across the island, but in a small kennel at the back of the enclosure. The creature was scarcely so intelligent as the ape-man, but far more docile, and the most human-looking of all the beast folk. And Montgomery had trained it to prepare food, and indeed to discharge all the trivial domestic offices that were required. It was a complex trophy of Moreau's horrible skill. A bear, tainted with a dog, an ox, and one of the most elaborately made of all his creatures. It treated Montgomery with a strange tenderness and devotion. Sometimes he would notice it, pat it, call it half mocking, half jocular names, and so make it caper with extraordinary delight. Sometimes he would ill-treat it, especially after he had been at the whiskey, kicking it, beating it, pelting with stones or lighted fusees. But whether he treated it well or ill, it loved nothing so much as to be near him. I say I became habituated to the beast people, that 1,000 things which had seemed unnatural and repulsive speedily became natural and ordinary to me. I suppose everything in existence takes its color from the average hue of our surroundings. Montgomery and Moreau were too peculiar and individual to keep my general impressions of humanity well defined. I would see one of the clumsy bovine creatures who worked the launch treading heavily through the undergrowth and find myself asking, trying hard to recall, how he differed from some really human yokel trudging home from his mechanical labors, or I would meet the fox bear woman's vulpine, shifty face, strangely human in its speculative cunning, and even imagine I had met it before in some city byway. Yet every now and then the beast would flash out upon me, beyond doubt or denial, an ugly-looking man, a hunchbacked human, savage to all appearance, squatting in the aperture of one of the dens, would stretch his arms and yawn, showing with startling suddenness scissor-edged incisors and saber-like canines, keen and brilliant as knives. Or, in some narrow pathway, glancing with a transitory daring into the eyes of some lithe, white-swathed female figure, I would suddenly see with spasmodic revulsion that she had slit-like pupils, or, glancing down, note the curving nail with which she held her shapeless wrap about her. It is a curious thing, by the by, for which I am quite unable to account, that these weird creatures, these females, I mean, had in the earlier days of my stay an instinctive sense of their own repulsive clumsiness, and displayed in the consequence a more than human regard for the decency and decorum of extensive costume. Okay, let me stop there, because I'm tired. Thank you for watching.